The university lecture hall was packed. Hundreds of students filled the seats, their eyes locked onto the stage. At the front of the room stood Professor Alan Mercer, one of the most outspoken liberal academics in the country. A man who prided himself on dismantling conservative viewpoints with ruthless precision. And tonight he had a new target. Mercer adjusted his glasses, his smirk barely concealed as he looked out at the audience. "Before we begin today's discussion," he said, his voice dripping with confidence, "I'd like to acknowledge someone special in our class tonight, a student who, despite his inherited advantages, has chosen to engage in real academia." A few chuckles spread through the hall. Then Mercer's gaze locked onto one person, tall, blonde, unshaken, Barron Trump. The professor's smirk widened. "Mr. Trump," he continued, "I hope you're ready to hear some hard truths tonight. Because in this room, we deal with reality, not legacy handouts." Scattered applause. A few students laughed. "Barron?" He didn't react. He simply sat there, expression unreadable, posture relaxed. Mercer leaned forward. "Let's talk about privilege," he said, his voice louder now. "How certain people are born into wealth and power, yet act as if they've struggled like everyone else." Murmurs of approval spread through the audience. Students nodded, smirking, already enjoying the show. Mercer's eyes never left Barron. "Tell me, Mr. Trump," he asked, feigning curiosity, "have you ever had to earn anything in your life?" Silence. The entire room turned to Barron. He sat still, unmoved. Professor Mercer chuckled. "Didn't think so," he said, turning back to the class. "And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why people like him shouldn't be shaping the future of this country." The room exploded in applause. Students clapped, cheered, some even whistled. Mercer stood tall, soaking in his moment of triumph. But what he didn't know, Barron Trump was about to shut him down in a way he'd never forget. And by the time this debate was over, Professor Mercer would regret ever calling him out. The applause was deafening. Professor Mercer stood tall, his arms crossed, a self-satisfied grin on his face. To him, this was already over. Another conservative humiliated, another lesson taught. But what he didn't realize, he had just made his first mistake. Slowly, Barron Trump leaned forward in his chair. His expression remained calm, but his eyes locked onto Mercer's with quiet intensity. Then, without breaking the eye contact, he stood up. The lecture hall fell silent. A few students whispered to each other, nudging their friends. They had heard stories about Barron, about how he carried himself differently than expected. But this was the first time they were about to see it in action. Barron adjusted his suit jacket, then with complete control walked toward the microphone at the center of the stage. Professor Mercer raised an eyebrow. "Oh, so you do have something to say?" he asked, amusement in his tone. A few students laughed. Some expected Barron to stammer, to falter, to say something ridiculous. Instead, he took his time. He placed both hands on the podium, glanced briefly at the audience, then turned his focus back to Mercer. And then he spoke. "You just made a very bold claim, Professor," Barron said, his voice steady. "But let's make sure we understand exactly what you're arguing." Mercer smirked. "Oh, I think it's quite clear, Mr. Trump." "No, I don't think it is," Barron replied smoothly. "Because what you just did wasn't a debate. It was a performance." A ripple went through the audience. Mercer's smile flickered, just for a second. Barron tilted his head slightly. "Let's test your logic, shall we?" he continued. "You claim that people like me haven't earned anything, that we don't deserve a voice because of where we come from. Correct?" Mercer folded his arms. "I'm saying privilege exists, and unchecked power is dangerous." Barron nodded. "I see. And tell me, Professor, where did you go to school?" Silence. For the first time, Mercer hesitated. Some students leaned forward, sensing something was about to shift. "Harvard," Mercer finally answered. Barron's lips curved into the faintest smile. "Harvard, he repeated. One of the most elite universities in the world. You know, last time I checked, tuition at Harvard was over $70,000 a year. Tell me, did you grow up struggling to afford food? Did you live paycheck to paycheck? Mercer's jaw tightened. What are you trying to say? He snapped. Barron didn't flinch. I'm saying that if privilege alone disqualifies someone from having a voice. Barron let his words hang in the air, then leaned forward slightly. Then why are you standing here teaching us? The room went dead silent. Mercer froze. The students? They weren't clapping anymore. Some were shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Others exchanged glances, processing what had just happened. Barron stood tall. The trap had been set, and Mercer? He had just walked right into it. A tense silence filled the lecture hall. For the first time that night, Professor Mercer didn't have an immediate response. Barron Trump had done something unexpected. He hadn't gotten defensive. He hadn't lost his temper. Instead, he had turned Mercer's own logic against him. The students were waiting, watching. Some leaned forward, intrigued. Others had their arms crossed, waiting for Mercer to take back control. Mercer let out a short laugh, forced, unnatural. Asterisk, 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 nice rhetorical trick. Mr. Trump, he said, waving a hand dismissively. But let's not pretend that your life and mine are comparable. Barron raised an eyebrow. A trick? I simply applied your argument to yourself. More murmurs from the crowd. Mercer's smile tightened. The difference, Mercer continued, trying to regain his footing, is that I built my career on merit. I worked for my position. I wasn't handed it. Barron nodded slowly. Interesting. So your argument is that personal success should be based on hard work? Mercer folded his arms. That's exactly my point. And right then Barron struck. Then why are you so determined to silence mine? Mercer's expression froze. The audience murmurs grew louder. Barron stepped forward, his voice even but powerful. If you truly believe that success should be earned through merit, why does my name automatically disqualify me? Shouldn't my words be judged on their own merit, instead of your assumptions about where I come from? A few students nodded. Mercer leaned against the podium, visibly irritated now. You're twisting my words, he muttered. Barron smiled. No, Professor, I'm exposing them. A beat of silence. Then, a voice from the audience. He's got a point. Mercer's head snapped toward the crowd. A few students were now whispering among themselves. Some had gone from smirking at Mercer's jokes to considering Barron's words. The professor could feel it. Control was slipping. And worse, Barron wasn't done yet. Professor Mercer could feel it. The laughter had stopped. The students weren't blindly nodding along anymore. Something had shifted, and that was dangerous. He forced another chuckle, shaking his head as if Barron was just some naive kid who didn't understand the real world. All right, Mr. Trump, he said, his voice sharper now. Since you seem so eager to debate, let's test just how much you actually know. Let's talk about wealth, power, and most importantly, privilege. A few students leaned in. This was what they were waiting for. You claim you've worked for everything, Mercer continued, his tone now condescending. So tell me, have you ever struggled? Have you ever been denied an opportunity because of who you are? The professor's eyes narrowed. Have you ever had to choose between rent and food? Have you ever been truly powerless? Silence. Mercer crossed his arms, satisfied. There, he had backed Barron into a corner. Barron? He just exhaled softly. And then he leaned forward. Professor, he said, his voice perfectly steady, do you believe in judging people by their experiences? Mercer blinked. Of course, lived experience is important. Barron nodded. Then let's test that logic. He turned slightly toward the crowd. Let's say there's a young woman sitting in this room right now. She's never been homeless, never had to fight for survival, never worried about whether she could afford her next meal. Does that mean she has no right to speak about fairness? About justice? A few students exchanged glances. Would you dismiss her opinion on social issues just because she didn't personally experience hardship? More students were murmuring now. Mercer's jaw tightened. That's not what I... Because if experience is the only measure of credibility, Barron cut in smoothly, then no one in this room, including you, has the right to speak on issues they haven't personally suffered through. The room fell dead silent. For the first time, Mercer looked rattled. Barron stepped back slightly, scanning the room. The truth is, we all come from different backgrounds, he continued. But the moment we decide that someone's voice doesn't matter just because of where they were born, we stop having real conversations. A few students clapped. Mercer's head snapped toward them. It was starting. The professor could feel it. His own students were beginning to listen to Barron. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. And Mercer, he was running out of ways to stop it. Professor Mercer's fingers tightened around the edge of the podium. This wasn't happening. He had spent years dominating debates, silencing conservative voices with ease. But now, the student he had mocked and dismissed was standing in front of a packed auditorium, shifting the entire conversation. And worse, people were listening. Barron Trump remained calm, composed, unshaken. You see, Professor, he continued, the problem with your argument is that it assumes wealth makes someone incapable of understanding real issues. He gestured toward the audience. But that logic is flawed. Because if privilege makes someone unqualified to speak about hardship, then what about the millionaires funding progressive movements? What about the Ivy League politicians claiming to fight for the working class? Should we silence them too? More whispers. A few students nodded. Mercer forced a laugh, but it was weaker now. You're playing word games, Barron. Barron didn't flinch. No, Professor, I'm exposing them. The audience stirred. Mercer's jaw clenched. Fine, he snapped. Let's cut through the nonsense. Let's talk about what really matters. Influence, power, and how people like you abuse it. A few students perked up. This was the aggressive Mercer they were used to. Tell me, Barron, Mercer pressed, how many doors have opened for you just because of your last name? How many advantages have you had that the rest of us never will? He leaned forward, voice dripping with contempt. Can you honestly stand there and tell me your life has been just as hard as theirs? He gestured toward the crowd, daring Barron to contradict him. For the first time that night, Mercer felt like he had regained control, until Barron spoke again. You know what's interesting, Professor? Barron's voice was almost amused. For someone so obsessed with privilege, you sure love using yours to silence people you disagree with. Mercer froze. Barron's expression remained unreadable, but his words hit hard. You claim to fight for equality, he continued, his voice clear and sharp, but you don't want a conversation. You want control. And when someone challenges you, you don't debate them. You try to humiliate them. More whispers from the audience. Barron took another step forward. That's not education, Professor. That's indoctrination. Scattered gasps. Mercer's expression twisted. That's ridiculous, he snapped. I encourage debate. Barron raised an eyebrow. Really? He glanced around the room. Then why was your first instinct to mock me instead of engaging with my ideas? A new ripple spread through the crowd. Some students were nodding. Others looked conflicted. And Mercer, for the first time in his career, he had nothing to say. A heavy silence filled the lecture hall. Professor Mercer's face was stiff, his mind scrambling for a way out. This wasn't just a debate anymore. This was a collapse. Barron Trump had done what no one else had ever managed. He had put Mercer on the defensive in his own classroom. And the worst part? The students knew it. Barron's expression remained steady, controlled. He had no need to shout, no need to insult, because he was winning. Let me ask you something, Professor, Barron said, stepping closer to the podium. Do you believe in free speech? Mercer's jaw tightened. Of course, he snapped. But that doesn't mean people like you. He stopped himself, too late. Barron's eyebrow lifted slightly. A wave of murmurs spread across the room. People like me? Barron repeated, his voice calm but pointed. What exactly does that mean, Professor? Mercer's throat bobbed. You know exactly what I mean, he muttered, shifting uncomfortably. Barron tilted his head slightly, letting the moment stretch. You mean people who think differently than you? A few students snickered. Others were now fully engaged, watching Mercer squirm. The professor cleared his throat. You're twisting my words, he muttered. That's not what I... It's exactly what you meant, Barron cut in smoothly. And everyone here knows it. Mercer's face flushed. He could feel his grip slipping. The classroom, which had once been entirely under his control, was now hanging on Barron's every word. And then Barron delivered the final blow. You talk about privilege, Professor. But the greatest privilege in this room is being able to control what others are allowed to say. The crowd erupted. Gasps. Scattered claps. Some students were grinning, nodding. Others whispered furiously, realizing how deep the shift had gone. Mercer? He had lost them. And he knew it. The tension in the room was thick. Professor Mercer stood frozen, gripping the podium like a lifeline. This was his lecture hall, his domain, and yet he had lost control. Students weren't laughing anymore. They weren't clapping for him. They were watching Barron Trump. Some were nodding. Others sat stone-faced, realizing for the first time that the professor wasn't the smartest man in the room. Mercer's mouth opened. Closed, opened again. Nothing. Barron folded his hands calmly on the podium, his voice smooth, deliberate. Let me make something very clear, Professor, he said, his eyes locking onto Mercer's. I don't stand here today because of my last name. I stand here because I refuse to be silenced. A few students clapped. More joined in. Mercer's face twitched. Barron continued, his tone unwavering. You preach about tolerance, yet you refuse to tolerate ideas that challenge yours. You claim to support equality, yet you treat conservatives as second-class citizens. You accuse others of privilege, yet you stand here protected, unchallenged, controlling what your students are allowed to think. The clapping grew louder. Mercer's hands balled into fists. Barron leaned in slightly. But today, that changes. A wave of applause swept the room. Mercer slammed a hand on the podium. This is not a rally. This is an academic discussion, he snapped, his voice cracking slightly. Barron didn't even blink. And yet, you're the only one shouting. The audience erupted. Laughter. Cheers. A standing ovation from some students. Mercer's face was bright red. He tried to speak, but the noise drowned him out. This wasn't his lecture anymore. It was Barron's, and as Barron stepped back from the podium, the message was clear. He hadn't just won the debate. He had exposed the very system Mercer had used to control his students, and Mercer. He would never recover from this. As Barron Trump stepped away from the podium, the applause continued to roar through the lecture hall. Professor Mercer? He stood motionless, gripping the podium, his face a mix of anger and humiliation. But it didn't matter anymore. The students had seen the truth, and the message was clear. When you try to silence others, eventually, the silence turns against you. Now I want to hear from you. Was Barron right to call out the professor? Or do you think Mercer had a point? Let me know in the comments. If you think Barron dominated this debate, press like, subscribe for more powerful stories like this. Turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. Thanks for watching, and remember, the loudest voices aren't always the strongest. See you in the next one.